The person with whom I had the longest-lasting friendship was a woman named Lara. We met in Bible college, early on. Neither of us could tell you the exact moment we met, but from my very first year in college we were friends. We sat together for chapel every Tuesday and Thursday, and many a Friday at 8 a.m., because we never seemed to have a class at that time any year we were there. We went to a nearby fast food place and got slushies. We started Slushy Day with another friend of ours, and invited others, but no matter who else went with us, Lara and I were always there. I could tell you a million stories about Lara. How she always seemed to have a wide selection of snacks in her backpack. How she always wore flip-flops even in the middle of those Missouri winters. How she loved the outdoors, something so opposed to my indoor-loving self. And I couldn't help but hear her voice every time she started a text or email with the words, "Hey friend." But one thing I will always remember when I think about Lara is how much of an encouraging presence she was. 2 stories exemplify this. One is that whenever it had been a while since we'd last talked, she always said that she'd been listening to my sermons. The one I preached in chapel my final year of Bible college she had to have listened to so many times that she probably could have recited it verbatim. And the second story is that when I was struggling with trying to get into ministry, she specifically moved with the thought of helping me, as much as she could. She moved nearby, not super nearby, but somewhat nearby. It's part of the reason why it didn't work out. The summer camp job she got was over an hour away from where I live. But just the sense of upending her entire life, in the hope of helping a friend, was amazing. Even if during that part of her life she'd been moving from state to state for those camp jobs. And as a side note, it was because of that job she got, an hour away from me, that she met the man who became her husband. A good man whom I got to know as I heard about their courtship and as I performed the marriage counseling and wedding for the 2 of them. Last January, I got a text from Lara. We'd been there for each other through so many good and bad times, but that day broke me. It didn't help that I had a whole lot of other bad news about my own health and other aspects of life at that time, but when a friend lets you know that they've been told that they need to get their affairs in order because this cancer looks terminal, it can break you no matter how the rest of your life is going. We lamented together, prayed for one another, and at the end of the conversation I said that I hoped that there are slushies in heaven, because we'd have to do another slushy day. This past July, I heard word that she'd died. Gone home to be with the Lord is the Christianese way of saying it. Sure, the truth is that death isn't the end, especially for we who follow Jesus, but it's still painful for the loss. One of the things that was asked of people who knew Lara was to write a story about her in the specific online location. I didn't have words at the time, couldn't put them in the right order, so I didn't write anything there. But as I researched the passage for this sermon, 2 Samuel chapter 1, in our continuing series A Song of Failures and Hope, a passage that displays the grief of a man as he hears the news of his best friend's death, I couldn't help but have Lara on the mind. At the end of the chapter, David gives word to his grief through one of the many gifts that God had given him, when he writes a song for Jonathan, and Saul, but mostly Jonathan. And so I thought about how to best give word to my grief through one of the many gifts God has given me. I mean, what's more apropos for a woman who encouraged me through listening to my sermons than using her as an illustration in one, especially for a passage involving one of the Bible's strongest and best friendships. And so I ask for you to join David and I as we grieve our respective losses, whether or not you've been there before. Because we all have people who've helped us be better versions of ourselves, people we wish we could immortalize in song and word, people who, even in death, motivate us to move forward in God's plan for us. In the last sermon, we learned of the death of Jonathan, 2 of his brothers, and their father Saul. We joined the news report, witnessed the brutality of evil personified. But that news had yet to be heard by David, yet to reach the city of Ziklag. Remember, in the sermon before that one, we saw David rely on God in the midst of so many emotions, the near loss of everything he and his men had, only for it all to be returned by the grace of God. They had barely just come back from that difficulty when a man ran up who claimed to have news. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 to 10. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. And David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people had fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my lord." Things were just starting to settle for David and his people in Ziklag. The sigh of actual rest might have just finally happened. But then word of someone running to the city came to David. Was it good news or bad? And how could it not be both, considering that he'd been living in a city gifted to him by a Philistine king because of his amazing work for him, all the while being an Israelite through and through? It had to be news of the battle. And when word of the messenger's torn clothes reached David's ears, I'm sure his heart couldn't help but drop. He had the man brought to him as quickly as possible, and worry hastened his question to the man, "Where do you come from?" He needed to know whether this news was from an agent of the Philistines or the Israelites. He had to know how to react to this obviously bad news. The same statement would require a different reaction depending upon which side told him. When the man said that he'd come from the Israelites' side of the battle, David immediately asks for the news. And it was indeed bad. Israel's army had broken. Many Israelite bodies lay strewn about Mount Gilboa, and that included Saul and Jonathan. When Jonathan's name is spoken, David immediately asks how the young man could be sure that they died. He needed verification for the flood of emotions to be let loose. So the messenger gives him a story that doesn't really mesh with what the last chapter had said. 1 Samuel chapter 31 showed us that Saul had asked his armor-bearer to kill him because Saul was so badly wounded. But because the armor-bearer wouldn't do it, Saul fell upon his own sword. And when the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell upon his own sword too. But here, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, the messenger says that Saul was leaning upon his spear, too injured to kill himself. And Saul asked this young half-Amalekite to finish the job. While some have attempted to harmonize these two accounts, like the ancient Jewish historian Josephus in his Antiquities, the more likely option is that the messenger was lying. He probably was just trying to get into the good graces of David, the most likely person to take the throne of Israel. The guy tried to look just the right amount of mournful for the loss of Israel's king, but also deferential toward David, to whom he paid homage. And bringing the crown and armlet, the symbols of kingship, to David, shows whom he would expect to be the best one to take the throne. So when the guy's story shows him to not be an enemy who slew Saul in anger, but a fellow warrior who did as his king asked, by putting him out of his misery, it's supposed to show both this guy's loyalty to the throne and to David specifically. The story just screams sycophant who's out for whatever will put him in the best position, although he didn't know that mentioning that he was part Amalekite was a bad idea in front of a bunch of guys who just slew a host of Amalekite raiders. Likely what happened, and I emphasize that this is my theory, is that this guy was a scavenger who was out looting the bodies before the Philistines got to them. He found the mother lode when he came upon Saul's body, took everything he could, and then realized that trying to pawn off the highly identifiable crown and armlet would be impossible. And so then he realized he might be able to use them to get in the ground floor with the next king of Israel, who would likely be David, even though he was currently in the Philistine city of Ziklag. My point is furthered by the fact that the guy knew that Saul's spear was a more identifiable piece of the king's gear. That's why the story speaks of Saul leaning upon his spear. But he chose to take the much more richly embossed crown and armlet instead. Those are the items of a looter, not the choice of someone coming to declare that the king was dead. While this messenger only saw what these events could mean for his future, he never would have considered what David's reaction to the death of Saul and Jonathan would be, which we see in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 to 12. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of Israel and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. The whole time that David was on the run, the wrongful thought about him was that he craved the throne, that it had been his prerogative to ascend the ranks and replace Saul. But we who have seen David's life and manner up until now know that it's the furthest thing from his mind. Time after time, David could have slain Saul, but he didn't. And his whole time as court bard and armor-bearer for Saul and general of the Israelite army, he'd known that God had anointed him as the next king of Israel. But David worked hard in all of those positions as a servant, not some arrogant snob who acted like he was already king. David's desire was to serve Yahweh as he saw fit, and that meant as a servant, until God led him to be king. David had fought and wept and fled and cried out and feared his own death, all in the manner of a servant. It wasn't kingship he craved, but godliness wherever he went. He wasn't perfect, sure, but it was never the crown that his eyes focused on. And so when the news of Saul's death, and especially Jonathan's death, reached him, it wasn't met with joy or relief because he could now return from exile. No, it was actual grief, loss, pain. While I really do think that Jonathan's death hit David hard, it's not like Saul was a nobody to David. Saul was like a second father to him, a man in whose presence he spent hour upon hour. A man who saw Saul at some of his worst moments and comforted him with music for much of it. I imagine that quite a bit of David's prowess with the sword was taught to him by the one whose armor he carried. How much of his stance and style with a blade were reflections of Saul and Jonathan? How many lessons can he remember whenever he wielded the sword? Thus, with fear realized that Saul and Jonathan were slain, grief let loose, David tore his clothes for the second time that week, wept to the last tear yet again, and the men with David, those who joined him because they were discontents against Saul, they too were driven to the same grief as their general and king. They too tore their garments and wept, battle-hardened soldiers, brought to tears yet again. Ziklag was probably the only Philistine city in the whole country not rejoicing and feasting that day. For the death of the Lord's anointed and his sons and the slain of Israel's army, they mourned and wept and fasted into the night. Words failed them at the moment. It was something they knew had to happen. Saul had to die for David to become king, but just because they knew it was coming didn't mean that it was easier to accept the news. And so David let loose his emotions until it was time for action. And when that moment came, he gave honor to both Saul and Jonathan, though he began with honor to the Lord's anointed. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 13 to 16. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite." And David said to him, "How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go, execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." After grief had been given a chance to flow, David returned to talking with this messenger. The young man again admitted that he was half Amalekite. Likely his mother was an Israelite. But after David asked how the man wasn't afraid to reach out his hand against the Lord's anointed, he had no answer. To David it was an important question, one he'd likely asked himself quite often. He had stayed his own hand before, and even stopped his nephew from assassinating the king himself. The one who put hand to blade to slay Saul would have to be an enemy of God, someone who refused to work alongside Yahweh. They would be the one who killed his anointed king. And so with crown and armlet in hand, David commanded the death of the self-admitted kingslayer. Best be careful the lies we tell, and really not tell them at all. Consequences might not be what we expect. This action of David would send a clear message. Saul's death wasn't by some assassin sent in the shadows by David. The way of Gentile kings would not be the way of God's chosen king. Subterfuge and power-grasping were not the rule of the day. Not for the one who waited for the work of God. Not for the king who would bring restoration to the humble people of God. No, he would grieve alongside them on account of the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about. David shows his honor to Saul as the Lord's anointed, by making his first action in possession of the crown be justice against the one claiming to have ended Saul's life, executing justice in honor of the Lord's anointed. And his second recorded act was to compose a song in honor of Jonathan and Saul, one that the warriors of Judah would sing, not in depression and immobilizing sadness, but as a motivating battle song. It was to give them purpose behind their mission against human evil, the evil that is epitomized by the Philistines. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 to 27. And David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. He said, Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places, how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant you have been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. This is a specific type of song, a song of lament. But as verse 18 tells us, David had it taught to the people of Judah. They were to know the song of lament, but keep in mind that it is restoration that God's chosen king will bring. Remember, the whole reason why I titled this series A Song of Failures and Hope is because the songs at the beginning of 1 Samuel and at the end of 2 Samuel declare the theme of, despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about, God's king will reign and bring restoration to his humble people. This song here in 2 Samuel chapter 1 perfectly illustrates the one more step we take in the midst of troubles. One more step, regardless of how much we want to give up. One more step, despite the opposition set against us. One more step in humility as we await the promised restoration of God's chosen king. The problems of this life, the death, the losses, the pain, the grief, they don't destroy us or keep us down. They are motivation to work alongside God in his restorative plan, strength to take one more step when we have no more strength left within us. Hope might seem lost in the moment, but God's promise of restoration is sure. It is our motivation to face every problem of this life. That's why this song was also written in a book that is lost to history, called the Book of Jasher, the Book of Uprightness. This book is also mentioned in Joshua chapter 10, verse 13, a reference to when God was with the Israelites when he made the sun stand still for them. This Book of Jasher seems to be a songbook for the battle ballads of Israel, heroic epics that recited mighty works done in the name of God. And this Song of David, this Song of Lament, was placed in it. A song which calls us to stand upright with the power of God in the midst of human evil and grief. Now, the reason why I consider this to be more of a song in honor of Jonathan than as a joint honor for Saul and Jonathan is because of both its title and the final verse of the song after the song's fake-out ending. We'll get to that fake-out ending in a minute, but some might be questioning how I know the song's title. Well, there's a word in Hebrew untranslated by the ESV that looks kinda out of place, and various other translations have tried to translate it in different ways, but it seems most natural to consider it the title of the song, and that title is The Bow. It is the bow of Jonathan that is mentioned in the song. The bow which gave Jonathan's warning to David that he must run so many years and chapters ago. The bow that Jonathan included in his princely gear when he gave it all to David. While Jonathan was proficient with both the bow and the sword, it seems that it is the bow that most exemplified Jonathan's fighting prowess, and differentiated him from his father, Saul. Thus, when David titles this song, The Bow, it is to honor his best friend, Jonathan, the prince who is so humble in his bearing that it's difficult to give him honor without honoring his father, with whom he was inseparable. The friend of David who gave up so much for him, among others. The friend who sought not his own best interests, but those of others through his encouraging presence. It was this same friend who made a covenant with David to take second place after David, but he would no longer be able to. That is the honor of the bow. There's a refrain in the verses, words repeated to showcase the song's theme. They're found at the end of verse 19 and at the beginning of both verses 25 and 27. How the mighty have fallen. We might use those words today in irony, describing the humiliation of someone as we rub their faces in it. But to David, these were words of honor to fallen heroes worthy of an epic ballad. It's a lamentation that two of the most heroic men of Israel had died. There was now less valor in the world because they had been slain. The world should miss them as much as David already did. I mean, just look at the beginning of the song in verse 19. the phrase, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places," and that's set parallel with the phrase, "How the mighty have fallen." They're synonymous parallels. David calls Jonathan and Saul the glory of Israel. They were exemplars among the nation, the highlights of the whole to which the eye is drawn, something special that the world didn't deserve, but were given by God anyway. In verse 20, David makes sure to name who's at fault for this loss. It's not God, but the Philistines, the physical manifestation of evil in the book of Samuel. We today in our grief might label the perpetrator to be sin itself, that bringer of all death to the human race. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, the two extremes of the major Philistine cities in the land. David knows that the news of Jonathan and Saul's deaths will obviously be told among the Philistines, but lyrically he's hoping that the rejoicing of the Philistines is short-lived, that God will send justice against those who slew these mighty men, that the joy of the daughters of those uncircumcised Philistines will turn to mourning very quickly. Then in verse 21, David turns to Mount Gilboa, that dastardly betrayer of its people. He sings curses against the mountain, that it will have no life-giving water ever again, that any fertility it might have once had will turn to the same death that it allowed the Israelites to experience. If it was so thirsty for blood, then let that be the last thing it ever drank. Just as how the shield of Saul was left covered in blood instead of being wiped off with oil, let that treacherous mountain be ever covered in the blood of its slain, never washed away, an eternal reminder of the deaths it allowed to happen. Both the words against the Philistines and against Mount Gilboa are a cry of how unfair it is that Jonathan and Saul have died. David's crying out for justice, crying that something be done against that which brought these problems of evil into his life, into our lives. It's the mourning that searches for some fairness in this world, for restoration to be returned to our lives. It's the pain that cries out, that lashes out, because we hurt and don't want to anymore. The begging and pleading we do that things could just go back to the way they used to be. That old version of normal that we want to go back to, even though we know we can never do that. It's normal when we face the troubles of this life, the pain and loss, to want someone to do something, to mend the pieces back together. Right then, we don't need platitudes or reminders of good theology or comments that things will be better someday. Every one of those words could be 100% true, but they don't matter in our grief. They don't make it any better. The truth is that most of the words we speak in grief are not what we really mean. They're all just our cries for restoration to be brought to our lives, for the pain and agony to go away, for a taste of heaven in the midst of our personal hell. There is no answer that can satisfy our outcry in the moment of our grief. The best thing we can do is let our grief speak, and then remember the good, and let that motivate us to take one more step. This is what David does in verses 22 to 23. He thinks of Jonathan and Saul in their mightiest. The bow of Jonathan that never retreated, even in the face of impossible odds. Others might have turned their backs to flee. The muscles of other heroes might turn to flab. But not Jonathan. No, his bow twanged all the faster, critting hit after hit. Headshot after headshot, ever true. And the sword of Saul never returned empty. When it was drawn, blood would be spilt. When he called the troops to war, he would lead the charge, executing God's justice with the edge of his blade. Enemies feared the role for initiative, because they would mean their end. Slice after cut after thrust. His blade sang the song of their demise. Vorpal in its manner as head after head fell before the might of his arm. They were beloved by many, and pleasantly regarded together. The pair of son and father were inseparable. Even death couldn't rend these two apart. The mighty warriors who could cause a ceaseless barrage with just the two of them. The two heroes who held up the nation with the power given them by God. In verse 24, David calls to the daughters of Israel to lift their voices, higher than the daughters of the Philistines. O daughters of Israel, weep over the death of Saul, the king under whose protection you were clothed in finery, the best and most colorful fabrics, the accents of gold that were more than just hints. And it's here, in verse 25, where we get to the fake-out ending. By repeating the phrase, how the mighty have fallen, it seems like David's lamentation is coming to an end. The instruments begin to fade as if near their rest. But David's personal sorrow has not found its rest. While Saul might have the daughters of Israel to grieve for him, it is David himself who will weep for Jonathan. the prince who adorns the high places in his death, that great glory in Israel who will not shine in this life again. The song turns personal in verse 26 as David sings his solo. The rest of the song was for Israel to sing, for the daughters of Israel to weep. But now, the simple yet powerful voice of David rings alone. I am hard-pressed for you, my friend, my greatest ally, my brother, my sister, the one who was always there, the one I could turn to when I needed it, the one willing to listen and advise, the one who would drop so much just because I needed help. This is what true love is about. Others might find comfort in the arms of a lover, but I have found more comfort from my friend. As David says, Jonathan's love was greater than the love of women. There was a deeper bond in their friendship than David ever found in marital union. They were joined in a way that was more binding than any sexual union. And I will reiterate what I have said in previous sermons. No, they were not homosexual partners. Their love had nothing to do with sex. It was a different kind of covenant between people that bound them. And after David's solo, the closing refrain kicks in. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. But again, the lament doesn't leave us to sulk or lie around in bed all day. The weapons God uses in his war against evil might have perished, but that just means new instruments must be forged, wielded by the hand of God, used to bring restoration to his humble people. The question is, will we allow the problems of this life to dull our edge to ineffectiveness, or will we use them to sharpen us, motivate us to continue with God in his mission to restoration? Yes, we must have time to grieve, to let out the emotions, to shout out for our enemies to be silent and for the mountains to be barren, to have a jumble of words that we can't put in the right order. But the time will come when we must act in line with God's restorative plan as we honor the fallen. Grieve, lament, but then take that one more step and work with God in his mission to bring restoration to his humble people. How the mighty have fallen, let the mighty rise in their place.